Go. Okay. All right. I'm going to type in here. Well, welcome everyone. I just wanted to let you know that we are glad that you're here tonight and joining us, and people are starting to trickle in to get online and join us there. I'm trying to set that up so we can do some chat moderating here and get together here with my friend Arodi Sanchez. All right. See if you're up yet, Arodi. I'm trying to make sure we're both logged in. Well, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Jason Rowinski, and I'm the executive director of Reaching Our City, pastor of Rock Church, and I'm joined by my friend and co-worker Arodi Sanchez, who works with me in both places, Reaching Our City Inc. and as pastor of Rock Church. And we are here tonight to talk about the movie Selma. We are actually in week 3 of 10-week kind of video curriculum where we are encouraging folks to watch a number of movies on the topic of race and justice in America. And then we get together at Tuesday nights live at 8:30 p.m. Central in order to talk about the movies. One of the things that we thought when we tossed all this around is, do we read books? Do we try to have a course or a class or whatever? But both of us, as we talked about this, thought there's the methodology of being able to bear witness to some of these things that many of us, especially white folks like myself, don't have to live with. Being able to see these realities and react to them kind of emotionally, viscerally, and all those things was a better way to get conversation going, at least in at the front end. We are open to books and courses and continued study and all sorts of experiences, but this gives us a chance to just invite people in to this broader conversation, hear a little bit from you, and that we do that through the chat. It would be really hard to hold these big Zoom conversations, so we limit the conversation to the chat. So if you're joining us, please feel to make yourself known in the chat. And Arodi and I are what we're going to do is we're going to go through 4 questions basically that we answer about every movie. The first one is simply, how does the movie make you feel? Like what is the emotional impact? What does it make you think? It's kind of just that basic gut human reaction that we have to things, to experiences. And even though these experiences are vicarious, they are still deep experiences in a lot of ways. That's the power of the visual medium. And then we talk about how we see kind of any contemporary analogy between what's happening in the film and what's happening in America today when it comes to race and justice in the church. And so we start to draw some parallels and see what kind of changes or progress maybe that we've made and how far we have to go. And we see how this conversation extends to that. And then we, as Christians, I know realize that everyone watching might not be a Christian, and we are glad you're here. Welcome you to join us. What we're asking you to do, though, when we speak from the Christian perspective, we are first going to answer the question of what is the gospel? What is the good news that Jesus brings into our world that speaks to this situation? There are a lot of different kinds of Christians, as we see nowadays, and we want to hone in on what the central Christian message is from allegiance to Jesus Christ, adherence to what Jesus taught, and then we look at tradition. 2,000 years of church tradition also informs us, as well as experience and reason together. So we look at those things and try to analyze our world in some kind of a framework to make sense of it. And then finally, we kind of go to those steps of what can the church do? What practical things might we do in everyday life then to apply social justice into our congregations, into our world, and be ministers of the whole gospel? So that's what we're here to do tonight and talking about Selma, which, of course, is a movie that deals with a critical part of Dr. King's life and the civil rights movement in the 60s. So, Arodi, I know you've had the chance to watch Selma more than once, not necessarily this week, but what are your gut reactions when you watch this movie again? What comes up to you on any level, artistic, spiritually, or what comes up to you emotionally as a dad, as a person of color, all of that? What's going on in you when you watch this movie?
Thanks, Jason. Obviously, it's a movie that is very loaded with emotions for many different reasons. The first thing that comes to me, number one, whenever you talked about Martin Luther King Jr., there's a sense of admiration and aspiration,
Mm,
a sense of encouragement, about who this person was and who what he fought for, in like a sense of wow, that's what a great man he was, and you're reminded again of that there were people like him, not just him, people like John Lewis or Jim Reeb, people that had the courage to take a stand for what was right. Uh,
mm,
so there is that sense, but then as you get involved in the movie and you hear words of them talking about fear and discouragement, there's also a sense of we connect very I connect very well with that sense of fear and
mm,
uncertainty. uh, Part of my gut reaction was also just this righteous anger, right? How could they do this to the people then? But then it gets me to where we are today. That many is still kind of happening. So we see what happened back in 1965 and in 2020. We see something almost the same, if not worse, when it comes to peaceful protests and the response. So because of that, there's also a sense of disappointment and a sense of wow, it's not that different, right? These
right,
40 plus years of work, there are some things that we have advanced, but there are some things that are the same. So there is a sense of a lament as I look at these things uh, in light of what we are today, right? Those events in light of what we are today. So a lament, joy, admiration, and aspiration, and encouragement to be more like uh, those who fought to take the civil rights movements forward and fight for equality. Um, so it's a mixture of lament and admiration.
yeah, yeah. This movie, it may have hit me more in this time than when we talked a couple weeks ago about 12 Years a Slave, because it's so much more our time. And honestly, I identified with and really was moved by the character of John Lewis because we still know John Lewis, right?
Mhm.
Um, we he's been involved in American politics, uh, in in our lifetime, right? So it is these are many of the people who were there in that movie are still alive today,
That's right.
and that is it hits me differently for some reason because when people will say what's going on, and we don't want to jump too far ahead, but what's going on today reminds them of what was happening, in the protests of the 60s. Some people have lived through both, and obviously, and I think that is it's powerful. Um, it makes me want it's different. One thing to live up to a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X or the martyrs of the movement who, in some sense, remain in kind of a modern sainthood, but
Hmm.
also, and we look up to them and quote them and follow them in different ways. But these people who are still walking amongst us that are still very real human
That's
provides a
correct.
different kind of energy for me
Yeah.
to want to engage. What really emotionally struck me was that character, well, it's a true life character of Viola Liuzzo, who's the
Hmm.
housewife lady that leaves her kids and her husband goes down there to the march and is very involved in everything and she's there. You see her in the film a lot. She doesn't really speak a lot, but you
Mm.
see her a lot, especially towards the second half of the film. And to know that driving people back from that great speech that ends the movie, she's gunned down by white supremacists. And I posted a blog along with it is if you where it really turned for people is she's a mom from Michigan,
Mm.
a young mom with 5 kids from Michigan who was moved by Dr. King's call to leave her family behind, and she ended up dying. She never
Mm.
got to go home,
Mm.
and that hit me. That the person in the blog said basically, you know, basically the depth of evil when they can kill a mom of 5 kids, a
Mm.
white mom in that time, a white mom of 5 kids, your ultimate suburban mom, your soccer mom that we would talk about today, your mom that
Mm.
you see at yoga class, or the mom dropping the kids off at Parents' Day Out, or whatever it is. That hate runs deep, and we see that hate. They show that hate really well in this movie
Mm.
differently than I think 12 Years a Slave. Again, it's close to our time, but man, I felt the hate a lot in the characters of the sheriff, of George Wallace, of of guys. Obviously the movie starts with the bombing of the little girls in the church,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
the hate just drips off that movie, and it's easy to dismiss it of kind of like, oh, that's not everybody,
Mm.
but it's a lot more than you think because if it takes a lot of hate around you to justify not only the martyrdom of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or somebody, but this simple nobody, quote unquote, nobody from Michigan, soccer
Yeah.
mom. That and that terrifies me a little bit, to be honest. That kind of hate that we see in Rwanda or the Serbian genocide or whatever, or we saw in Nazi Germany, that kind of hate really is here too. I think we've kind of made ourselves feel immune to that,
Hmm.
but that the veneer of civility in our society has masked something that's very dark underneath it, and I'm still wrestling with that. So that's probably a longer way to say that. Man, the hate really got to me in this movie.
Mm. Very, like I said, it's interesting. You notice that hate, and I noticed the despair
Mm-hmm.
of the black people, right? You notice the hate of the white people. I notice the despair of the of the black people. That's kind
Yeah,
of
that,
interesting
that
because
is
that's what
interesting.
that's like I said, it, it's almost like, but all this hate, right, and all this despair, they have one thing in common. This the despair, they're both realities of the collective. They are both realities of the group. The hate is not able to be acted upon if there is not a collective support of it.
Right.
So the despair is not really, wouldn't doesn't have as much power if there's not a support of it, right? So even Martin Luther King Jr., when he is imprisoned, or when he's having that conversation with John Lewis in the car, he is discouraged, and despair, is something that can only combat it with them when they continue to give words of encouragement to each other in different settings. Martin Luther King Jr. does it from the pulpit or from the
Right.
stage. People do it to him in private, and hate is given amongst those who were hateful folks on that time of the white group. They will give each other hate, right? When they were talking, we're not gonna let that happen here. This is our yard. This is our state, right? They kind of rattle each other out. So I just want us to notice that collective reality
Mm.
of both entities in this movie and how powerful that is.
I think that's a really keen insight. Um, Hate, we're used to that being kind of that group think, that mob mentality we talk about. But a lot of people will say today, even why black people don't just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and just get over it. But there's a collective despair. You see it. You're right. You see it in the movie, and even Dr. King has it. But everyone's looking to him to kind of lead the way out, right? To be that Moses figure, part the seas of despair for us, so that we can then walk together. No one's walking on that bridge alone, and
Mm,
really, the African Americans couldn't do it alone. When
mm,
the white people come and say we're your allies, it helps lift everyone, and that's where that really dramatic. He turns around on the bridge,
mhm.
and everybody's mad. Like they're ready to go because they're ready to be done with their despair, and he's worried for their lives,
Yeah.
and it's super powerful. But I think that speaks to some of the things that we look at today, like why these protests and why these movements, and why can't we just quietly go about making change or things like that.
Yeah.
But if it takes the collective to hate and it takes the collective to get out of despair, there is a kind of psychological and even spiritual shift in the power of community, which is what the
Mm,
church would say, right? And so I think that really answers the question of what's all the fuss about. And I hear that from white people, to be honest, and I actually hear that a lot from white evangelicals, which causes me to despair, and which is probably why it's nice to get online and talk about things like that with people who are at least willing to have the conversation. So even we need it. We're hosting something for people to talk, so that we can bring some collective power
mhm,
into the solution. So that's really good. I'm glad you said that. There's a lot of parallels with that and why we need movements at all.
mm,
It's
absolutely.
really good. So what are some of the other one of the things that stood out to me too, just with Dr. King, is the way the movie presents it is he knew he was going to die at some point,
Mm,
right? I mean, his wife's trying to get, like, let's get a house, and he's like, oh, maybe I'll teach college and pastor a small country church, and you just watch her face and really his face as they're saying it, that ain't ever going to happen, you know. And as Kennedy gets killed and Malcolm X get killed, I mean, he knows he's going to die. They try to warn him at the end of the movie, like, you might die, and
mhm,
he's like, I've already kind of made my peace with it,
mhm.
which we might have to come back to when we talk about the gospel. But what is that? What did that do for you? I mean, did you pick up on those tones in Dr. King?
Oh, absolutely.
Because that's different than his despair. There's a resoluteness to him in that, I think.
Yeah, especially towards the end, at the very end, once they win that court ordered, and there's the guy telling him, "Hey, don't you want this? Don't you want the best for you?" And he said, I cannot think of what's best for me. There are so many thousands of people that as long as they see the light ahead, there's hope for them, right? They can continue to move on.
Yeah.
Uh, it's I think it is something that we obviously we every human being has, whether you follow Christ or not, you gotta ask yourself the question, what do I live for? What am I willing to die for?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that I'm gonna really live for my life? And I know I'm gonna sacrifice whatever I need to sacrifice in order to accomplish this, right? There's a sense of purpose that very few people really attain that kind of resoluteness and assertiveness about who they are and who they want to be and where they want to go, and a mission in life for something greater than themselves. And that is like you said, it is all throughout the movie, very in subtle ways, where it's very clear. Uh, he doesn't. It's not like he doesn't have regard for his life. He said, I'm just like any other person. I want to grow old. I want to live a long, happy life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, is this what life is all about? Is it about my self-preservation alone? Is it about what is just good for me, right? So that is something that speaks volumes uh, to, today, just
Yeah.
today about with everything that is happening in the world.
Yeah, I keep looking at these people who are giants, and maybe you don't know. And I think you maybe know a little bit when you're living with them. It's easier to look back and go, "Wow, those were very important people." And I'm trying to think of in our world today, do we have that kind of in our American world? Do we have that kind of resoluteness? The people that have have basically said what's happening here for all people is requiring me basically to lay down my life. I mean, I think the people that have laid down their lives for our current movement of racial protest, Black Lives Matters, whatever, have been people who were, because of the camera, unjustly murdered. Mostly
Mm,
young black boys or black men, for the most part, not exclusively, but they weren't. We have leaders of movements and things like that. We have popular media figures, but I don't know if we have a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X or a John Lewis yet. I mean, we haven't resisted to that point. Maybe there's some change that society has wouldn't allow us to get to that point quite in the same way as they did 40 or 50 years ago. But I don't know. I can't. I kind of feel like when I'm making drawing parallels that we have really short attention spans
mm.
in all of us, really, for the most part. Um, but I don't know, and because it seems like that kind of change definitely requires that depth of commitment. So I don't know. What do you think? Are we there? Do we have people? I mean, I'm sure they exist, but I don't know if I could name a leader that rises to that level.
Yeah, I think yeah, I don't think you're wrong with it. There is there's a lot more information. There is tendencies to not to stay as focused as people could be because there's a lot more distractions out there, and there is so many sources of information and misinformation. Um, that is, I think it has become very difficult to trust nowadays and to find people with integrity. That there's a clear cut leader. Yeah, I mean, you and I were able to experience that even when we went to the rally right here in Oklahoma City, right? There was no
Right.
this clarity of a sense of direction or purpose on what on who was the person that we needed to listen to. There was a collective group. And I don't know if this is better or worse. I think it's good that the movement doesn't rely so much on the charisma of one individual,
Right.
and at the same time, people crave to put people crave to find the individual that will be, this person kind of represents uh, what we stand for, not that necessarily speaks for all of us, because not even Dr. King spoke for every black person in America
No,
back then.
no,
No, no, not very many people didn't feel like he was doing the right thing or the right
right.
approach,
Right.
but there is a sense of where do you stand clearly, right? And I think that speaks to the leaders in terms of clarity. People will always value integrity, but they will only follow clarity. If you're not clear on what you are standing for and what you're saying, they are not going to necessarily follow you.
And that's good. And I think that brings up a whole host of issues with our contemporary. Moving into that a little bit more clearly, what's going on today, and at squarely in that movie, not the disagreement between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King isn't really highlighted as much in this movie as it is in others, or in books, or in history about methodology. And it just reminds me, a lot of the anger of people opposing the movement is chalked up to at first to, like, I don't like the way you're doing it. You should protest differently, which is really funny to me. And I think about you know Colin Kaepernick, and at first, just sitting down and being disrespectful, listening to, in his mind, wasn't being disrespectful, but to a lot of people, listening to a soldier saying, here's what that looks like, choosing to respond and say, you know what, I'm going to still respectfully kneel, which was, to me, it was a beautiful that he was open and listened and took instruction. But it's just like, no matter what methodology it is, we've had a lot of peaceful protests, a lot of peaceful protests. Yeah, there are some figures from what we saw and what we know. They weren't black people, to be honest. Most of the rebel rousers or whatever that we saw were younger white people who have another kind of agenda, it seems like. And so there's always these side agendas in the movie. Are we going to be violent? Are you going to listen to these guys? Should it be local? Should it be national? And there's all this kind of debate over methodology. But what it comes down to me in the end of the day is you could be Malcolm X and threatening people's fears with kind of violence, black violence in return. You can be socialist or Marxist or whatever and say we just hate your economic system. You can be peaceful, you can be whatever. And at the end of the day, no one likes the movement. It doesn't matter. And so I'm like, I'm going to call your bluff on this methodology thing. You know, I don't think it's about methodology. I think it's about hate and fear. I think it's about not wanting change. I think it's about all those very base human emotions, tribalism. I don't think Now, I personally will take the Dr. King's direct action nonviolent resistance methodology. I would ascribe to that. I do think it's the best one. But at the end of the day, what good did that do? I mean, it does do something in the long run, but people were complaining about him. The president was complaining about him doing that peaceful methodology. So I've kind of just reached my limit in myself about people complaining about methodology because nothing really is going to be. It's not going to make anybody happy other
I
than
mean,
silence.
the the
Silence is the only thing.
the irony of people complaining about methodology is that people find themselves being paternalistic and colonialistic when they say you are protesting and that's not the way you should protest. You are
Yes. Yeah.
protesting my power, and I'm
Yes.
telling you with my power the
Yes.
way that you should protest against me.
Right.
So that is the funny thing about it, right? That's the crazy irony about this whole
Yeah.
situation. And
Yeah.
you have to understand what is in the dynamics here when people do and say, oh, they should do it this way, or why do it that way. At the end of the day, if if we were uh, if we were all treated with equality, that this wouldn't be an issue. If we were held true as a nation to really withhold what we say that we value, we wouldn't be here today, right?
Yeah.
So all these minorities are asking is that people stay true to their word, to what they say they believe.
Yeah. What are other parallels of that movement and what we see going on that really came up in your mind? What are there's some, I think, more analogies to make of, oh yeah, we see that happening, or we've not figured that one out. What else is standing out to you?
I think something that stood out to me is that even with giant movements, even with strong movements, with strong leaders, uh, there's in history has demonstrated there's always a pivotal event that really it is the tipping point of the movement. In this case, it was the killing of of Jimmy Lee, I believe,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So we see it in our contemporary situation with Black Lives Matter has been a movement for a while, and there has been some pivotal points. But the George Floyd death has been a really huge tipping point for this whole thing. I mean, to the point that even the Redskins are changing their names. I mean, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. It's
people
true.
thought that never was going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So eh, I think so. There is this obviously it is not okay that it takes a major tragedy this way, but something that I notice is all these movements, all these things, if it takes a major event for it to happen for people to take action and uh, it's always so and again I'm kind of going towards the end here, but always this, the particularity of the event affects the the general aspect of the mission. The particular always affects the general, right? We cannot come we cannot come just from this general perspective saying, well, black people are dying or about
Yeah,
people are being
yeah,
abused. We had to say George Floyd was killing. This is the way it was killing. You had to witness it
yeah,
in order to be able to believe it and create transformation. So transformation doesn't come about when we just talk about it in general ways with no
yeah,
names, with just with just ambiguous
yeah,
in terms of what to express things. But transformation comes about when the particular is in our faces. When we're confronted with the particular.
yeah. You're right, and I think we live in the stories, and Dr. King understood that. I mean, he was really strategic about media and attention. He knew if people read about protests or whatever, that narrative was going to be shaped in papers and everything. Of course, TV was just really taking off, um, but he understood that you had to see it. You have to see it at least to experience it, a story that you can identify with. And he wanted to make sure the cameras and the press were trained on that. He was very strategic about that, and I think that not that George Floyd did that. What's different is everyone is a storyteller with their camera phones now. So the attention can get there in the craziest ways. Some little iPhone video can go viral and the whole world can see it now. So it's a lot easier to draw attention to things. Um, but it's also really interesting is I feel like that the pushback that we get in something like against Black Lives Matters and you get all lives matter,
Mm.
or you get the whataboutism, like you say Black Lives Matters and we need to deal with racism, and they'll say, well, what about abortion, or what about global poverty, or what about? I'm like, great, I'm asking you to enter into a story right now. I'm not saying none of those other things don't matter necessarily. I'm just saying let's deal with this. Like someone got murdered in front of me, and you want to tell me about the cops writing you a speeding ticket 2 towns over. Okay, sorry, but you got caught in a speed trap, but this person just died.
Mm.
And this is what I don't think, honestly, and I'll speak to the people that I know best. They're my people. The white evangelical church doesn't get that this is not a legal fight, so to speak. It's a fight for recognition. It's a fight to be seen. And we've talked about this before. The God who sees, you
Mm.
know, um, the people of color who are experiencing these things on a daily basis are saying, "See me," and we have that Netflix when they see us, about the Central Park Five. The in any fight that you get in, the other person, the opponent, um, will try to overrun you. And so, conflict management, for example, talks a lot about just the power of recognition, where we really are able to enter into the experience of the other person. And I think the mistake of even well-meaning white evangelical people who want to engage is to come in and do what you said. They don't listen to the story, but then they try to tell you how that you should live your story. Now you shouldn't, and if you've ever been in a fight with your wife, I know you and I have been in fights with our wives, um, and you dismiss them and you invalidate their feelings from the jump, you're in for a long night, and you better fix that. So that validation and recognition, those are all relational terms, and I really feel like I just see a lot of white pastors trying to kind of steer it and educate and get a little bit abstract with it, and when it's really, I wish someone would just get up and say, and I think we've seen a few people do this, but maybe somebody more prominent would get up and say, "Man, we hear your pain and we see you, and we're here to stand by you and listen." Kind of like what we
Absolutely.
did when we went to the rally. We're like, "Hey, we're just here to show up and support you. We were invited by the black pastors of our city, and just to be with them." And I thought that was the most powerful thing.
I think again it speaks about to our lack of understanding of what proper conflict resolution is.
Yeah,
So if you're to bring it back to the family life, if your wife confronts you about the door in your bedroom that needs to be fixed, and you said you were gonna fix it, if you say, "Hey, but laundry hasn't been done," I mean,
Yeah.
why do you have to focus on the door when laundry hasn't been done? When we haven't done the dishes,
Yeah.
that's not
Yeah.
gonna go well. The
Not
issue
going
at
well.
hand is the door that you said you were gonna fix hasn't been fixed, right? So
Yeah.
it is this dismissive idea that we keeps happening. We want to say, oh, what about that issue? What about this other issue? We want
Yeah.
to distract from the reality of things. It's, again, I go back to the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan didn't say, "Oh, in this road, people get beaten all the time.
Mhm.
This is normal. This is a normal sight. There are people dying everywhere." Or what about these people in Samaria that are suffering? He didn't
Yeah.
ask the question. The
Yeah.
issue at hand, the conflict at hand, the the what was happening. He took on that and was present there, right at the moment of need. And
Yeah.
that is what black people in America are simply asking for. Let's be present in the moment of need in this here. Let's not point fingers here or there. We see with President Lyndon Johnson, right, when he was telling Dr. King, "You got one problem, I got 101. You think this
Yeah.
is the only problem?
Yes.
I got all these things." You see it. It's the same narrative that has perpetuated with those in power in America, right? You only see your issue when I have so much more to deal with, or
Yeah.
there's a lot more, in a sense, like you should be thankful that we have done this much. You should be
Yes.
thankful that you are a little bit more free, and
Yeah.
even though you're not as free as I am. So that
Yes.
is the issue.
Yeah. No, it is. And we see that, speaking of the government, some of the responses we've seen are directly parallel. Um, in '67, the FBI had an operation against what they would call black nationalist hate groups, and they targeted the Southern Christian Leadership Center and Dr. King and other civil rights leaders. So, we've had, like, let's name this, like, really not very existent group and call them terrorists. And we even in Oklahoma City had some people who did do some property damage, uh, white kids basically, and our DA here has charged them with terrorism. And I'm thinking, it's insane, using the law that way when, I've watched people do worse after KU basketball won a national championship, and they're not charged with terrorism. So
Mm.
it's silly, but the government has been wielded as a weapon a lot of time to keep people oppressed. The other thing is, Dr. King was accused of being a communist. This has been a long-standing charge of anyone of a smaller group out of power trying to change power dynamics are always accused of being communist. There's probably some truth to that in some of those situations because communism does talk about power disparity, right? Marx definitely talked about that. And I think so. There's this critique now that we can't engage Black Lives Matters because they're maybe terrorists and they're also Marxists. So what do you see to that? I mean, is there anything valid that we need to look into? Does it matter? Are we just obfuscating things? Are we just trying to be abstract? What's going on? Because history is repeating itself with this. These are the same charges that happened against protesters in the '60s. So what are your thoughts on that?
Man, that is one of those things that I have despair for. Right? It is you continue to be labeled as something. You continue to be named, and what you bring to the table is not recognized as valuable and useful and important, right? And that's why these movements gotta, as difficult as it is to manage them and deal with them, we need to be able to give them the freedom to express their needs, express who they are. They have that capability, as Paulo Freire expressed on
Yeah,
Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? They can name themselves. They can bring amazing stuff to the table. You don't have to come with your idea and overimposed upon this group of
yeah,
oppressed people,
yeah,
uh, because then that's going to create more suppression, that's going to create more anger, that's going to create more hatred, that's what it's going to do.
yeah,
So uh, ironically enough, uh, we the only way to counteract that is when those who have power say, okay, let's listen. What is it that you are naming yourself? What is it that what is how do you go about these issues? How do you want to express them? We want to listen instead of trying to overimpose that and trying to call them names and label them. Uh, and again, when we go to this name calling situation, it just doesn't help. It's again, it's it continues to perpetuate that great division and chiasm that has created all this chaos from the beginning, and from the beginning of humanity. So since Abel and Cain,
Yeah.
this chasm of you are less, I am more, kind of a thing.
Yeah. Well, labeling always dehumanizes, right? I mean that's what labeling is meant to do. When you are called a name, to me, whenever anybody calls me a name, I know that they've already lost the argument, and essentially whatever we're fighting about, because it means they've got nothing substantial. And when you have to throw out things out there, usually it's uninformed opinions. I mean, look, I, I think people need to be aware of what communism, at least the communism, a lot of what we've seen expressed in the 20th century, has perpetrated some significant evil. And I think people have a right to be discerning and to think about that. What we've seen in the research and what we've seen most people, like Mitt Romney's out there at a Black Lives Matter march. Mitt Romney is no communist, never will be. Those kind of thing is can how do we engage the sentiment or the moment with and still being able to say, I my like I do or you do, my allegiance is to Jesus. I might care about this or that, or we might have some things that bring us together, as we saw, and you mentioned it, that there was not necessarily a monolithic black voice in the
Mm,
'60s like we think. I mean, Martin and Malcolm did not agree. I mean, Malcolm
mhm,
said some things about Martin Luther King, especially calling him Uncle Tom and things like that, which is a
mhm,
pretty serious accusation back in the day, especially. And so we think everyone speaks with one voice. That's the thing. Just because we all get together doesn't mean we're all alike
yeah,
necessarily. Like there's this rush to make everything uniform. I
yeah,
think we like to make sense out of things that we don't understand. So that's why we label, or that's why we make these kind of guesses. But engage before you speak.
mm,
Get to know. Someone was asking me about it, and I just said about it once, and I said, "What have you gotten to know? Have you talked to any of your local Black Lives Matters leaders? I mean, have you just talked to them?
mm,
I'm sure there are people that you might really like a lot, but before you talk about them, talk to them. Seems sort of like at least from a Christian perspective, seems like a very Christian answer to
mm,
things. Go to that person if you're concerned or whatever, but we don't have to buy lock, stock, and barrel into those things because the gospel does tell us a story,
mm.
and we can engage that. So, um, what is the gospel according to Selma? In that sense. If you're going to sum up what you see the undercurrents of the gospel, obviously this is a very Christian movie in the sense of Dr. King's faith and a lot of people's faith in this movie, Christian faith specifically, was on display, um, talked about in the movie. So what would the gospel according to Selma be if you thought about that and drew some comparisons with what Jesus taught?
Well, obviously, it's uh, this this idea of turning the other cheek, right? This no
Mm-hmm.
violent reaction. This Dr. Luther tried his best to stick to the ethics of the kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
right? To the ethics of Jesus, not and that is of course a very challenging thing to do, especially when you love your enemies, when you pray for those who persecute you, you love those who only display hatred against you. Doesn't mean that you agree with them. Doesn't mean that you are not gonna point out uh, the evil or the wrongs that they're doing. But what it means is that you don't retaliate on the same level.
Yeah.
You don't do that. You don't. So that points out. And again, and I'm gonna also bring about this concept of the particularity of the event, right? Of the particularity of the person or the event. I think again with Selma, it took for people to see it and experience it
Hmm.
on TV live or hear it on the radio live,
Yeah.
for people to really start changing, right? I think in the, if you look at the person of Christ, the particularity of the event of the cross was what made the difference, right? And also the particularity of the resurrection and the person of Jesus. So the particularity is very important of what how in the person of Jesus he took up all the violence and all the pain, right? And show us a new way to live, show us a new way to be human in a
Yeah.
sense. So I see those connections right there. Uh, the particularity of the event of the cross of the pain and the ethics of the kingdom as Jesus presented it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we don't see it with Dr. King as much. We know the end of his story, but to me, it was um, the gospel according to Selma's, greater love has no one than this, and he lay down his life for his friends.
Mm,
And there is this friendship that you see in Dr. King's inner circle all throughout. But you've got um, uh, Jimmy Lee lays down his life,
mm,
so his dad, becomes the first black man, to vote basically at the end, and he had to give up his life, uh, it, and Jimmy Reed,
mm,
who was the white pastor that came down from Massachusetts, and his death is also another turning point of people who were willing to lay down their lives uh, for someone else. And then again, like I mentioned, Viola Liuzzo. There are three we don't see her sacrifice in the movie though, but
mm,
there is a I will give my life for you ethic, um, which is there is a kind of liberation to that. I'm going to lead us out by example. I'm not going to ask you to do something I wouldn't I
mm.
wouldn't do, and I think you see that in Dr. King and everyone. He knows he's asking a lot, and people do pay that ultimate price. And I don't know if we can get, no matter what it is in the kingdom of God, there there is no resurrection unless there's a death.
Mm,
There's no new life without death. Unless a seed falls to the ground and dies.
mm,
So what I don't know about our time, I mean, we've seen other people being killed, but it's the people who have something, they don't have to die, so to speak, but yet
mm.
that they choose to die,
Yeah.
that creates the transformation. And whether it's this in civil rights in the 21st century or other things that the church is looking to do, like I said earlier, I'm not sure that we, and I might even say me, anybody is at that point where we really are saying, I'm lay my I'm going to lay my life down for this. It's
Mm,
worth it. Um, there is something better, and I don't know. So to me, this movie is really challenging in that. Do I have that kind of lay down my life? And we know we've talked about the pushback that you get um, if you show up at a march, or
mhm.
the name calling, the financial hit that comes to churches, at times, and membership hit and things like that. So there is some sacrifice, but to the point
Yeah.
of blood, to the point of death, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Maybe we're not going to ever get there, and I hope we can change without it. But something in me says that in the kingdom that you never see resurrection unless you first see death. And so
Mm,
I don't know what it's going to take. What do we have to die to as a church? And maybe even a metaphorical death. What do we have to die to? Do we have to die to telling people how to live their lives, or telling people that we don't know, that we know better than them? Um, do we have to give up power in even more conscious ways of saying, you know what? um, we might scoff at something like affirmative action, and maybe you don't do it by coercion or by law or force, but pastors saying, you know what, this church needs a person of color or a woman or somebody to be at the top spot, and we need to rethink the way we do it. If we're ever going to get anywhere, someone's going to have to surrender power.
Mm.
So I'm just thinking through all of those implications still, but I know that's really greater love has no one than this, and they lay down their life for their friends, and really all the white people, you know, who decided to finally join in the struggle, um, brought a different kind of attention to things, and I don't think that the white people's sacrifice on the whole is anywhere near what black people have to sacrifice. But there is a whatever our sacrifice is, we better figure it out.
Yeah,
We better figure it out.
absolutely. That's a great question. And again, I think the when it comes to what the church needs to die to, what the church as a whole needs to focus on, uh, we gotta ask ourselves the question. What who do we need to die to the thirst of power and control, right? Uh, of a majority group or a group with or a group with a different social economical status that is higher than the other, right? Who do we give our preference to, and why? Who are we? How? So we have to go. It's a question that in our minds we have been rationally taught to think through these things, but when it comes to practice, it's the status quo remains, and we really have to be intentional in asking these questions. That quite honestly, uh, people don't want to ask. People don't want to, and they don't want to be talking about that in the staff meetings. They want to
No.
be talking about how we're gonna get our numbers up. Want
Yes.
to be talking. They don't want to be talking about these things in a staff meeting, and
No.
because it's tough, it's confrontational, it's difficult. But I think it starts there with the staff meeting.
Yeah.
How we come about our business and what is important for us.
How do we show people that we are present in our community, caring about the things that really matter for their lives, not the things that we want to put into them, but in the things that we want to get out of them, like church attendance or tithing or whatever it is, and even good things for their life. We want people to come to know Jesus, but there's something about showing up and saying that we are practicing the presence of God in the midst of them. We are trying to be priests, uh, modeling to them that God is with them, and I think that kind of stuff, yeah, that doesn't show up on district reports very often. I don't have a question on how many protests I've been to that I have to answer for. So all of those things are definitely different. But I do think that our problems, like you said, even at the beginning, we see things differently. Just even when we watch this movie, you picked up on the despair and I picked up on the hate, but I'm identifying with and trying to figure out how could my white people, my people, so to speak, how could they be that evil, and wrestling with that. And you're saying how can my people, people of color, how can they how do they get through? How do they keep going in the midst of all that?
Mm,
And so we get down there, and maybe and so we're talking about church things. Maybe we don't make decisions unilaterally without the voices of the oppressed and the
mm,
suffering. Not even the pastors. I mean, there's some congregationalism in this, a little bit of listening to the people, although then that just becomes an opinion fest sometimes.
mm,
But I think really being present in people's lives and really knowing what they're facing and saying, I'm not going to make a decision, because that goes back to Paulo Fry, what you were mentioning earlier, that assuming that people can figure things out for themselves, that they have resources within them that 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 can be empowered, that we don't have to have all the answers, and we might not have all the answers, and that's okay. Um, And then I like Ted Jennings' book, Good News of the Poor, and he's a Methodist theologian, liberation theologian, probably by training, but who went back in and looked at Wesley's, what he would call preferential option for the poor. How do you keep pushing the marginalized to the front? You know, they're always going to get pushed to the back by everything in society. How do we take what, you know, maybe Paul would say our least honorable members and give them a seat of prominence?
Mm.
You know, those kinds of things are practical. Um, putting people who wouldn't be in power anywhere else, giving them a sense of power and decision making and autonomy and whatever, um, responsibility is probably a better word in the church. More about that. I think we have to do more, and that's systemic, that's strategic, that involves that. Churches of today and going into the rest of the 21st century, if you don't have a good, diverse leadership team pastorally and on your board that looks like America, not just your corner of America, I say your church isn't going to survive for very long.
Mm. Mm.
You know, so I think we
Absolutely,
got to take some of that stuff pretty seriously.
absolutely. And like it's like you said, the key is not just to have representation on your pews or chairs on Sunday. That is passive representation, but to have actually active leaders and voices in your congregation that have a role to play in your community, that have a role to play in your faith, in your faith circle, right? That is listened to, that is heard, that is seen, that is valued just as any others. Uh,
Yeah,
we're not asking about value more than others, but just value as much. And I think that is a huge thing. I know that for me, when I was given that opportunity to be in the same plane, in the same level, right, on the same, when we're talking to each other, not at each other, right? We're talking that way when you really listen and value my opinion as a black man at work or at church or at school. That is important. That's when I feel like I belong here. I
mm,
have something to bring here, and I'm valued here, right?
mm-hmm.
So that's I think we really have to take it serious on that regards. And I don't think I don't think that unfortunately many churches, especially our tribe in the Church of the Nazarene, that has been necessarily the case.
Yeah,
There has been a very clear sense of uh, sort of suspicion when you come to the table and you look like me or you come from a country uh, from a different country or so. There's a you have to almost uh, earn your stripes or whatever in order to be able to for them to take it seriously. And that is something that I have sensed, and I have many others like me that have experience as well. So I think we need to change that. We need to change this idea of you are valuable only if you do this and this or that, or only if you get this much education, kind of a thing. I think
yeah.
we gotta really listen.
Well, I think you're right, and I know, like our friend here in Oklahoma City, John Middendorf, has done a lot to bring Christian leaders, especially, together. And they've instituted some pulpit sharing because let's face it, a lot of our congregations are just white,
Hmm.
and in the evangelical world, at least many of the evangelical world, and it's just like going back to what we see when I read scripture and you read scripture, and you know my own experiences when we preach, it comes out of who we are, and if we keep on having kind of the echo chamber of
Hmm.
white person, usually white male, reads scripture, interprets scripture as white male, mostly middle class, and repeats it back to white male, mostly dominant, middle class, working class people, we might be missing out on some of what the scriptures are actually trying to say from a culture that was Middle Eastern, you know. And
Yeah.
so pulpit sharing, I think, is really good. The other thing that really makes me think of in this movie, especially, and I think we experienced the power of it with being invited by the black churches in our city to
Hmm.
come and join them as they went to bear witness to the Black Lives Matter rally. Um, Maybe we don't do enough direct action and protest in a very big collective experience, as you bring it full circle. What kind of collective things can churches talk about? We talk about, like, let's do our collective Fourth of July party or something, or
Hmm.
retreat or something like that. Those are usually things that are pretty insular, or they're designed with the idea of let's get invite people to church. But when have we seen like massive collective Christian movement towards social justice? I wonder if we're just Dr. King knew. He understood that to move people's hearts, they had to experience something, and you have to get noticed in this world to get people to want to experience that. So I don't know if there's more that marches that we could do down 10th Street or something, but maybe there's something there. Any other thoughts about what the church can do on your end?
Oh, well, again, in terms of working together, I think we just got to reach out to each other a lot more. I think there's a sense, I think we need to celebrate together and we need to lament together. There is a lack of communal lamentation in this country. I think there's a lack of communal grieving in this country for the tragedies, uh, for all tragedies. Just acknowledging that there was a human being, part of our community, part of our country that now is lost, right?
Yeah,
I think that's something that we can do better. We definitely can improve there in this communal grieving. Uh, we are okay at celebrating together, but grieving together, that's something that we don't do very well. And I think that's something that we can practice, reaching out to other churches and other groups and coming together. And of course, doing things together, such as Good Friday, Easter, and Christmas together. Of course, celebrating the great events in the Christian calendar together uh,
yeah,
with different communities. I mean, to me, that's more like heaven, and coming together in taking part of the communion and doing baptisms together. Uh, with people that don't look like you and other
mm-hmm.
churches and maybe that Hispanic congregation or Korean congregation where we come together. It doesn't have to be every time, but we can do it together, do it once
Yeah,
a year and see what that does for people. See how that starts changing perspective because then we start to get to know folks, right? We start to get to know who they are, where they come from, and I have, like I said, we all have biases and prejudices. It's not a matter of whether you don't. It's like a belly button. Everybody has one,
yeah,
But you have to when you get to know the person for who they are and what they bring to the table, and we celebrate together, we cry together, we eat together. Um, it sounds cliche, but it's not cliche because we don't really do it.
no,
So
no. We're so consumed, and it just really does make me think about what we're all doing as churches. To be honest, um, we've created our own internal competition. It is hard. I mean, we just have so much going on, so much activity. But activity, is it leading to transformation? Is it leading to a movement? Is it leading to justice and righteousness and things like that? And I don't know. I don't think on a real communal sense, a collective sense, it really is. And it you have to lay down some things to get there. You're not going to be able to keep on doing like maybe all your sports leagues if you're going to really engage social justice. Not that those aren't bad. Those might actually be transformed in a way that they're less about competition, more about community and take on some other justice aspects. Maybe it's just the way we do things needs to be transformed. My hope is that we start to really understand, and this is for myself as much as it is speaking on behalf of of white people, white evangelical, especially white evangelical men. I hope we can listen better and stop trying to take leadership. I know it's natural, and I think people are doing it naturally because that's what we've learned. White men are leaders, and so we're going to lead. And that's just kind of the way. I don't think there's necessarily anything nefarious about that on the surface, but unchecked, it just you'd be like bossing your wife around all the time and never listening to anything that she says. it's going to make people mad. And they're going to start to assume you don't really care, even when you maybe do care. And I just hope that we can listen better. And even the church in general. It reminds me of that time in Blue Like Jazz that Donald Miller and his friends set up a confessional booth at their very liberal college. And so people came in and they were expecting, like, these Christians are being really holy and they want to hear our confession. And they said, no, we're here for us to confess the church's sins and our sins to you. And I feel like for me, that would go a long way if us white people, especially us white Christian leaders, would do that. If we did that, then we might actually find ourselves in a place at the seat at the table where people feel like they're heard, so they're communicating to us differently. I don't know. That's just what it brings up in my head. Anything else you want to end on here in the last couple minutes?
Uh, Again, just touching back of where is the gospel in all this. I think is very clearly, especially when Jesus reads Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me,
Mm,
for he has anointed me to what? Set the captives free, to preach the good news to the poor. Uh, when we are talking about of freedom from oppression
mm,
and freedom from those who are hurt and those who are ostracized, we are not. This is not a political agenda. This is not about being liberal. This is not about being with a political party. This is what Jesus was about.
yeah.
He was about setting the captives free and
Yeah.
bind up the brokenhearted.
Yes.
This is what he was about.
Yeah.
So I think is he, you know, that's how he started the first sermon. That's the passage that he preached from, brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And we gotta remember that.
Yeah.
We gotta remember that this is the gospel in a nutshell. And God's people were enslaved people, and God Himself came down with power to set them free from oppression. And He kept saying, "Remember when you were slaves. Remember when you were oppressed. I set you free." God is a God of freedom. God is a God of empowerment who gives Himself to us to empower us through the Holy Spirit, so that we can continue to do his work in our lives. He's the God that gives power. He does not the God that hoards power for himself. He's the God that gives away power and breaks chains and brings freedom and binds up the brokenhearted and gives sight to the blind and set the captives free. This is the gospel. So it's not a side agenda. It is what it is about.
Yes. And for our little tribe of Nazarenes, that very power is the Holy Spirit in us. We see it at Pentecost. All these things that you talked about happening happens not in our own strength. We live this Christ life through the power of his life at work, his spirit at work in us. And may we be those kind of people. There's still a lot of work to be done. I want to acknowledge the progress. I understand that a lot of the butting of the heads really just comes from the way that we have learned or not learned how to enter into conflict well, and to be peacemakers and to listen and to recognize and to validate. And if we would just focus more on the relationships, I think we'd get there. But yeah, we've got a lot, and we're gonna have a team next week to talk about the Freedom Riders, a little bit more the documentary side of this movement, which I think will bring up a whole host of other issues and give a lot more fuller context to this story of Dr. King and Selma. Um, May we continue to learn from these folks, the ones that
Mm.
we know that are still alive and with us today, the ones that died then, the ones that have died since then, and then look for those kind of modern freedom riders, those modern slave liberators, today, and then trust that God's got this, that
Mm.
God's got this, and because those are the things that He cares about.
Mm.
Thanks for joining me, my friend. I'll see you at work tomorrow. Everyone else, I appreciate that you have been with us, and please feel free to join us at 8:30 Central Standard Time here on the YouTube channel and engage in the chat if you would like to. I also would say we'll make these videos available. So if you can't make this time, maybe watch them, maybe get a few friends and watch and engage the conversation with us where you're at locally. That's really what we want this to be, is local conversations evolving out of this. So I appreciate it. God bless you all, and we'll see you same time, same channel. Have a good one.